Okay, so for us here in this chapter, we're kind of building on the theme that we explored in chapter one. And that chapter one theme, again, was that economics was the science of scarcity. And that when we see scarcity existing, meaning we don't have enough resources to meet all of our wants and needs, then we are faced with these trade-offs, essentially these decisions. What do we decide to do, one thing or the other? In this chapter, we get to look at our very first model, which again is kind of an assumption from reality, an abstraction from reality. And we look at how these kinds of trade-offs exist within a country. And essentially, in this chapter, what we get is some defense of free trade, why trade exists. We will be looking at all three of these parts. All three parts of this are important. Okay, so just like chapter one started off by talking about, like, for instance, why iPhones are made overseas but are designed in the US, we kind of can look at this decision for a company like Ford. And in essence, the question would be is like, why does Ford decide to um, build its cars where it builds them? And then how does it decide what kinds of cars to build? And this actually becomes pretty important, especially this example here, because I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, so right now it's 2024, um, in probably even just a year ago, there were like so many news articles talking about from like GM and Ford. I'm talking about how they're just going to shift all their resources and they're going to make just electric cars. They're going to stop making hybrid cars. They're going to stop making gas cars. They're only going to make electric. And then, like, in the past few months, it's been like the complete reversal. And at the same time, everyone was critiquing Toyota and saying, hey, Toyota, why aren't you making electric cars? Why are you still sticking with your, like, hybrid cars? And then it turns out that consumers were still wanting to buy hybrid cars. So now Toyota's just going to keep doing what they were doing, and now Ford and GM are having to kind of shift their activities. The question would be is, why is this the case, right? The government, in some sense, was kind of pushing GM and Ford to make more electric cars, providing incentives and whatnot. But at the end of the day, what they had to realize is that, right, by making all these electric cars, that it was going to take them away from being able to make more sales. And eventually that trade-off decision has to be made by the shareholders and the CEO, where then eventually they decide, you know what, we just need to stop making so many electric cars. These trade-offs are difficult decisions, to say the least, right? And we all face them. Ford, the company, has to decide how is it going to allocate its workers, its machinery, its buildings. Is it going to make more gasoline-fueled cars, electric cars, what? Right? And even we face this as households, right? For instance, in my household, I drive a really junky car, but the reason why I do that is, as many of us in Hawaii know though too, is that many of us send our kids to private school. So almost all of my income goes to paying private school tuition. It means that I still have to drive a junky car. The trade-off exists. I'm not grumpy about it. It just exists because it is what it is. Now that's my trade-off, right, for my income family. Right, we as a society probably get more concerned when the trade-off is one of like, should I buy health care or should I feed my family, right? That's also a trade-off. It's just sometimes we're talking about trade-offs that are really unfortunate, and we don't even want families to have to face that trade-off. I mean, if I, lost my job or got lower pay for my job, all it would mean is that my kids have to go to DOE school, which I don't think is like the worst thing in the world. But I'd still be able to feed my family, right? So sometimes the trade-offs are also socially acceptable. Sometimes we don't think that they are. Or again, like for instance, healthcare versus food. I think families should be able to have both. personal opinion. So how do we understand this trade-off in terms of the goods produced? In terms of the goods produced, we can understand that with the production possibilities frontier. And what it is it's a curve that's going to show us our maximum production of the goods. Now, the reason why I like it is that it encourages my kind of positive analysis here. So let's draw it out so that we can see what this looks like here. So what we typically would see here is that we would have a country, let's say the US. And we would say, here's my first good, and now we're going to say, here's my second good. So I have two different goods that I could be producing. Good number one, let's say that good number one is computers, and good number two is cars. So I can make computers or cars. And the idea here with the trade-off is that if I start off with a lot of cars, then I can't have very many computers. And that as I produce more and more computers, as I produce more and more computers, I'll have fewer cars. And so this, we would see a trade-off. This is not a demand curve. You know, it kind of looks like it here, but again, the axes are different. The trade-off that exists is that, in essence, to produce cars, sorry, it's my pen here. What I'm kind of trying to fit in here is that to produce cars requires less computers, right? Or vice versa. To produce more computers means fewer cars. So this is as we have here in our description here, this is a positive tool that is in essence telling us what our opportunity cost is, because that's going to be the slope of that line, of this frontier. So this line here is showing us our maximum production of these two goods, let's say computers and cars, with the resources that I have. So behind the scenes of this graph are people, our buildings, our machine, our natural resources. Now, if we had more of those resources or less of those resources, it'll shift our PPF. Now, I should say this too. For those of you who are learning somewhat by the Khan Academy or whatnot, sometimes I call this a PPC, Production Possibilities Curve, instead of PPF. They're both the same thing, so don't worry if you're seeing something different on the internet. But what it essentially, that slope of that frontier is showing exactly what the trade-off is. How much I have to sacrifice of one good to have more of the other good. And so here we can see in a much more beautiful picture that we also have three relevant regions of this frontier. We have a region below the curve. Let's just draw it over here. Just going to draw a general curve here. We have this area below the curve, which is inefficient. Why is it inefficient? It's inefficient because, what if I was at this point right here? Let's call it point A. It would be possible to get more of the goods that are on the y-axis without giving up the goods on the x-axis. Or it would be possible to get more of the goods on the x-axis without giving up any goods on the y-axis. Or it would be possible to get more of both. So there is no trade-off required at point A. That is why it's inefficient. I'll repeat that again because that's pretty important. Point A is an inefficient point. The reason why it is inefficient is because it would be possible to get more of both goods without giving up the other. Or it would be possible to get more of one good without giving up the other. We can see that here, right? I could get more gasoline-powered F-150s without giving up Lightnings. I'm guessing that's the electric one. I could get more electric cars without giving up the gas-powered cars. Or I could get more of both. That's why F at this point is inefficient. A, B, C, D, E are all efficient. And they are also attainable, meaning possible. A, B, C, D, E are all efficient because getting more of one good requires less of the other good. And the points outside the frontier are impossible, are not attainable. We don't have enough resources to get these goods, so that would be like our point G. That is not a possible point. You can't have 60 gas-powered vehicles and 50 electric cars produced in a day because we don't have enough resources to make that. And so again, the slope of the PPF is the opportunity cost. And we're seeing that right here. We can measure it. Now in this case, the slope is constant. So that would mean that the opportunity cost is constant. And all we have to do is look at what the trade-off is. Now we could look at it numerically here, but let's just look at it graphically. That if I went from B to C, I would have to give up 20 gas-powered cars, and I would gain 20 Lightnings. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. Let's go from C to D. So I'd go from 40 to 20, and from 40 to 60. So it'd be going down 20, and then this way it'd be going up 20. So it's also a 1-to-1 ratio, right? One is negative. I'm giving up something to get more of the other thing. And we're going to see this 1-to-1 ratio across this entire slope. So this is a particular kind of production possibilities frontier called the linear PPF, meaning that the opportunity cost, or the slope, is constant. Now, not all production possibility frontiers, though, are linear. In fact, most of the time it's not. Most of the time, the PPF is bowed outwards like this. The reason why most of the time the PPF is bowed outwards is because not all resources are equally matched to producing the goods. Here's what I mean by that. So we could generally think, let's just look at the examples they give us here, automobiles and tanks. And that for the most part, right, automobiles and tanks are produced in a rather similar fashion, right? They've got something that's moving them, right? Either it's like those like tank things or the wheels, right? Something is moving the vehicle, right? And yeah, the car has some more doors and the tank has that like thing on the top that you like pop your head out of. But you can imagine I could probably use the same workers in factories to produce both kinds of things. The problem starts to emerge, though, if I only want to produce tanks or I only produce cars. Because what happens is that I have to start to use resources that are really only matched well to doing one of the things. So as I kind of already highlighted, the idea of putting like tank tracks on a tank is not the exact same thing as putting tires on a car, right? The tools might be able to be used for both, but maybe not equally well. Nor maybe will the workers be equally good at producing both things. It'd be like the equivalent of me saying, what if we weren't talking about automobiles and tanks? Okay. What if we're talking about college classrooms? I mean, I don't know. I'm not a bad college professor. I kind of know what I'm doing. I know how to manage a classroom. I certainly know economics. But what if we decided that we only want to teach literature and books? Oh God, like I don't even know what I would do. I'm not I'm not. Truth be told, I've read parts of Tale of Two Cities and parts of Romeo and Juliet, and that's about it in my life. Now, I've existed pretty long in my life without having to read most of those books, without a lot of books. And we've got obviously professors and faculty who just read books all the time. My rendition of Romeo and Juliet is going to be made based off of me seeing that one movie, Shakespeare in Love, and that's about it. I don't even know if there's a movie about Tale of Two Cities. It's going to be a pretty bad class, even though I'm really good at professing. So it's not going to be very good. Instead, if you just said, okay, Shane, you clearly know the least in the entire university about any book, we'll just let you teach as much economics as you want. What you would see is that you're not going to lose a lot, right? In this case, this is my English class. And this is now, we made this econ classes. You're going to be able to get a lot of econ classes without giving up very much English courses, because I'm going to be pretty bad at it. So that's why it's kind of like really flat. The slope is really flat at that point. Now, the English professors I do know are very kind people, but I don't think know a lot about economics. So the reverse happens here, right? They don't give up a lot of good. They're not very good at economics, which is fine, because there's something to do. But they are very good at English courses, right? So that's why it's very steep here. It's just, again, this idea that the resources, this is the key idea. The resources are not equally matched for the outputs. They're not equally suitable for the outputs. Now, what we can also understand here as well is that as economies change, the PPF will shift in and out. Now, we could talk about economic growth. That would mean that we have, for instance, more people, more resources. Well, then it shifts, the PPF shifts out because I have more resources, which now, as you see, means that I can have economic growth, means I can have more of both goods. Right, because now the frontier has just shifted out. This is why politicians and everybody really likes economic growth, because it generally results in more of all goods. But it goes the opposite way as well. Right, the reason we could say the fires in Maui were so destructive is that what it represented was people dying, cars being destroyed, buildings being destroyed, and a basic reduction in the size of the economy. For those of you who are historically oriented, right, World War II, as destructive as it was in Europe, was not as destructive in the United States. We had a loss of people, right, people dying in the war, but we didn't really have a lot of attacks inside the United States. And so that resulted in a much smaller shift of the PPF in the United States as opposed to Europe. And sometimes the technological changes that are happening, that could shift the PPF, don't equally affect both goods. So in this one, both goods we could produce more of both goods with whatever this resource increase was. In this one, the technological change really only helped in the production of automobiles, but didn't really help in the production of tanks. Not unreasonable to think that, right? We could talk about this whole electrification thing. You can't imagine that we would be moving tanks and have them propelled with electric, like with batteries, but that improvements for electrification of automobiles obviously really helps automobiles. Let's not worry about this here. So again, if I skip a slide, it generally means I don't think it's as important for us to understand that. Now, with this idea that consumers have certain production possibilities, then the idea is that different people or different countries have different production possibilities. And that we can present it where then people have choices of what they're going to produce. So let's look at this example here. We have two different people, me and my neighbor, and we both have apple trees and cherry trees. So let's draw this out. Okay, so here's me. And then here's the Swansons. Those are my neighbors. Okay, and here's the idea, is that they've got a PPF for cherries and apples. And so do I, cherries and apples. And that for me, it's a 20 to 20 ratio. 20 to 20. And I'm going to connect the dots. And my neighbor is 30 apples to 60. So now what's the slope here? For me, it's 1 to 1. For my neighbor, though, it's 1 to 2. 1 apples to 2 cherries. 1 apple to 1 cherry. How did I get that? Because I just took my 20 apples to 20 cherries and I divided each side by 20. Over here I had 30 apples to 60 cherries. And I just divided both sides by 30 so that I got 1A to 2C. So that's the opportunity cost that my neighbor, the Swansons, and I each face. I have a 1 to 1 trade-off. My neighbor has a 1 to 2 trade-off. Let's look at this a slightly different way, though. Okay, so here's mine, 1A to 1C. But for my neighbor, 1C costs half of an A, right? Because it could divide each side by 2. So look at that. Here's the question. Who makes cherries the cheapest? Who makes cherries the cheapest? The Swansons, right? The Swansons make cherries the cheapest. And they only have to give up half of an apple to make a cherry. Who makes apples the cheapest? Me. I make apples the cheapest. It only costs me 1 cherry to make an apple. It costs the Swansons 2 cherries to make an apple. All of this now gives us a basis for trading, though, because what this means is, why should me, Scheiding, be making so many cherries? Right? Cherries are expensive for me to make. I have to give up an entire apple to make a cherry. But my neighbor, the Swansons, they only have to give up half an apple to make a cherry. So shouldn't the Swansons focus on cherries? And why are the Swansons even making apples? Apples cost them 2 cherries, whereas an apple only costs me 1 cherry. Swansons and I each like apples and cherries. So why don't we focus on what we do well and then trade for the other thing that we need? That's the idea of the comparative advantage and the basis for trade. The comparative advantage comes from who's ever making the goods the cheapest. For me, for Scheiding, I have a comparative advantage in apples. For the Swansons, their comparative advantage is in cherries. Okay. Now we'll look at these formal slides where it looks much cleaner looking, but you have this kind of description now of what I said of how things should exist. So right here's the PPFs, the ones that I just drew. Nothing different. And then here was what I said is the consequence of that, is that we're then going to focus on the thing that we are really good at. That word for focusing on the things that we're really good at is called specialization. So I'm going to focus on what I'm really good at and then trade for the other thing that I need. So I'm going to focus on apples. The Swansons are going to focus on cherries. And then we're going to trade for the other thing that we need. And that's what we see right here. Is that I'm going to produce something where if I were in a situation where I didn't trade with others, I'd have to pick some combination of having both apples and cherries. I'd have to do it myself. And so if I did it myself, I could have 8 apples and 12 pounds of cherries, and my neighbor could have 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. What if I then traded? Could I get more? So here, this is both my production point as well as my consumption point if I don't trade. Let's write this out here. If I don't trade, production is the same as consumption. Sorry, I know this handwriting doesn't look clear, but that's why I'm saying it as well. It's not that I have bad handwriting, I'm just trying to use this digital pen kind of thing. So if I don't trade, production point is the same as the consumption point. And you can kind of see this here. My consumption and production, my neighbor's production and consumption. But now if I trade, the production point and the consumption points are different. What did I say? I was really good at apples. My neighbor was really good at cherries. So why don't I specialize? Why don't I produce just apples? And my neighbor just produces cherries. And then we come up with some agreement at what we'll trade each thing for. In this case, let's do one apple for 1.5 cherries. Then I'll give up 10 of my apples and get 15 cherries. And that point B actually exists outside of my frontier. And before you say, whoa, ho, 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 Scheiding, that's illegal, you can't be outside of your PPF, I can consume outside of my PPF. I just can't produce outside of my PPF. So actually everything is legal here. I'm still within, I'm producing on my PPF, but I'm consuming outside of my PPF. And my neighbor also benefits from this transaction. She would give up 15 cherries, so she's going to go from 60 down to 45, and will gain 10 apples, and thus being able to consume outside the frontier. So what we're saying here is that trade allows us to consume outside the frontier. So free trade is mutually beneficial each person can consume outside of their frontier. Okay, and so we could kind of draw this out, and you could kind of, make a table and see what these gains from trade would be. It is generally speaking, though, why the general belief, despite what you hear from politicians of both parties, is this somewhat controversial statement of free trade benefits all. Everyone benefits from free trade, at least within the country as a whole. Now, there are losers to free trade. People, the countries of Vietnam and Indonesia make like 95% of the shoes purchased in the United States. That would mean that if you were a shoemaker in the United States, you've likely lost your job because of free trade. But we, in the country as a whole, enjoy cheaper shoes. Shoes are more affordable because they are produced in countries that can produce more of them at a cheaper cost. So the reason why Nike and Adidas and whatnot, why they make their shoes in Vietnam and in Indonesia is because it's cheaper to produce them there. And the reason why it's cheaper to produce them there is because in terms of the people and the resources and the factories and whatnot, they're designed to make shoes cheaply. Versus expensive to make them here. So it's not enough to just be big. That's what having an absolute advantage means. Absolute advantage just means that you're big. The United States, a country like Russia, has an absolute advantage in almost everything. We don't make everything. Economists focus on the comparative advantage, which means, again, that you get the lowest opportunity cost. Countries trade according to their comparative advantage, not their absolute advantage. Which is essentially what is just said here. Countries trade on the basis of their comparative advantage, not their absolute advantage. I will talk about this one here, not that you're going to be tested on it, but it does highlight this case. Different people are just good at different things in any household. For instance, in our household, I am generally charged with making sure bills are paid on time. It's not that my wife is financially irresponsible. I mean, she earns more than me, and she is in the field of finance. So in terms of money management and whatnot, it should be her that does it. But I take the time to do it, and I pay it well, and I pay things on time, and I'm good at that. That's my comparative advantage. I don't have a comparative advantage in buying clothes for the kids. My wife will go to the store and buy clothes for the kids. That's what she specializes in. She knows their sizes, she knows what fits where, and whatnot. It's not that I couldn't do it if I had to, it's just if I'm really good at paying bills and I'm not as good at shopping, then why don't we just focus on the things that we're good at, and then we all enjoy the benefits as a family in that division of labor. Okay, so then generally speaking, with with households having a division labor, with countries having specialization and trade for goods and services, then what we rely on are markets to exist where we can trade these goods. And as we said, that in a market, what we imagine is that there's two groups in this market. There are those who are producing the things and those who are buying the things. And the household is generally understood as providing the factors of production, meaning the things that we use to make other things. That'd be like labor, capital, natural resources. And that companies buy these things from us to be able to produce things that we as consumers buy, using the money that we were given by the firms for the means of production. So when we look at this, right, if we look at something like, let's just stick with the same example here. Let's just do this McDonald's example here that they seem to be starting off with. Obviously, McDonald's hires lots of workers. They also have the restaurant, right, and they have the equipment inside there, right, like the fryers and the fridges and obviously the building. And then they buy natural resources, right? They buy food, they buy potatoes, they buy water, they buy meat, right? They buy these things that are used and combined with the capital and the workers to produce things. And then the final part to this is the entrepreneur, the person that decided at McDonald's to put this restaurant in a particular place, right? Or the person at McDonald's who decided, let's do the app so that we can get more orders out the door, that kind of thing. Combine all those things together and we get the product that's produced. And that is all done in the product market. So then we have households and firms interacting in two markets. The factor market, again, the market for their labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurship. And then the households turn around with the money that they make in the factor market and they buy things in the product market. Whereas in the, and this is a pretty good chart that describes this, the household is selling things in the factor market and buying things in the product market. The firm is on the opposite side. They are buying things in the factor market, right? And so we can kind of make this comparison here for the factor market. And we'd have this comparison here for the product market. Where a group is buying in one, they're selling in the other. And that's what we see in this circular flow diagram. The circular flow diagram is describing how markets work in general, and that households and firms, the two primary agents, are interacting in two different markets, the factor market and the product market. Again, they're buying in one, selling in the other. Now, this is a simplified vision of reality. We don't have the government in this example, we don't have foreign buyers and sellers, and we don't have the financial system. And the beauty of this entire course is that we'll look at those, we'll desimplify this example as we go along in this course by adding the government and the financial system and the foreign sector. So markets in general are preferred. I myself am guilty of this preference for markets. And it's not an old idea, as this kind of Adam Smith, born on June 5th, same as me, in 1776, wrote a pretty famous book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And what he was looking at was this very simple question, which at the time was, why is England so rich, which it was at the time, and why is Portugal so poor? Why is that the case? Why is one country rich and why is one country poor? Is it just because, sometimes people say like, the environment and whatnot. That's not really the case. What Adam Smith basically found is that England succeeded because they had strong markets that encouraged entrepreneurship, specialization, and division of labor. And so because England set up its economy so that you could have division of labor and that there was an encouragement of free trade, that it got all of these other things. And what you also see in Adam Smith is this idea that in market systems, the reason why things work out well most of the time is that individuals are acting in their own self-interest. And that collectively, if we're all acting in our own self-interest, then that allows prices to be lower with this level of competition. And it allows consumers to buy whatever products where they value the thing being produced. Okay, so, and we see this here, right? This is just a perfect example that we're just seeing right now. And it's also, to be honest, what we're kind of seeing in this political debate. And I'm not trying to stick my nose where I don't want it. But this was the whole idea, right? Was that I'm making this lecture now in August, end of August 2024. We had this debate earlier where Republicans were really mad at Democrats. Like, why are you giving so many incentives for people to buy electric cars? We don't want your electric cars. I mean, that would be the argument that Republicans were making. And then the argument that Democrats were making was people should have to buy electric cars because gasoline-powered cars are destroying the environment. Well, the market system turns out to be really strong in the United States, and strong enough that it is true, right? The government can encourage us to buy electric cars, but they can't force it to happen. And that's essentially what we saw here in 2024, is that consumers are still not buying electric cars. So at some point, either the government will increase its incentive, or they'll just give up trying to push us to do it. This isn't the first time that we've done this. Maybe 20 years ago, the really big push was for cars to use gasoline, but also a mix of corn called ethanol, and they wanted cars to use a lot more ethanol. People didn't end up buying those cars, and so the result was that they made fewer cars that were running on a lot of ethanol. It happens, right? These markets as well, what they do is they also create, they highlight all the knowledge that's generally needed. This is a pretty important slide. This is actually highlights some of the very first research I actually did in economics. If you're a good Googler, you could Google something back to the late 1990s. I did this really interesting research project where I looked at, in economic history, that you could look at what was the advantage that someone had as a settler arriving in an area before others. Because they would know crop prices, they would have merchant relationships. How could they improve how they did things more than later arrivals? So we had this whole idea of, what economists call human capital. And I'd done some earlier research on this local human capital concepts. We have it a lot here in Hawaii, right? I mean, what's the reason why people who have never lived here move here and then leave after 1 or 2 years? It's not that people from Hawaii are inhospitable to outsiders. It's just that in my perception as an outsider, as a person who came from the mainland, I rely heavily on my wife to get to survive in Hawaii, because I need her and all of her local connections and local knowledge to be able to survive here. Right? And then why do people who leave Hawaii always seem to go to Vegas? Because, right, they can rely on other people they know from Hawaii to survive in Vegas. Whereas if we put someone from Hawaii and put them down in the middle of Iowa, they will suffer, not only from the cold, but also from the fact that Iowa is a very different kind of place that involves different kinds of human capital. Okay, so I'm just going to skip that here. I will say that I have changed as a person over time. I used to really dismiss the entrepreneur. I've noticed that as a person, I am maturing more towards entrepreneurship. Not exactly sure if you can teach it still. I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. I still think that some people are just more entrepreneurial in the way that their brain is wired, and some people are not. But I do think you can train entrepreneurs to be better business people, right? Teach them accounting skills and management skills and whatnot. But I think it's actually pretty difficult to teach someone to be an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is just someone who finds a different way, a more creative way, a better way to combine the labor, capital, and natural resources to make things. Elon Musk, you might really disagree with him as a person, but he turns out to be a really good person, at least, for designing an electric car. And at this moment, he's the only one that can reliably put someone in space. So even if I have personal differences with how he lives his life, I'm not going to cross him because I actually think he is of value to the economy. And in this case, it's better to work with him than to go to war against him, even if you disagree with him, because he just has skills in this way. And we can and someone can appreciate that that basis of him. All developed economies that have markets also depend on a strong legal system. There needs to be property rights, and there needs to be a court system that enforces those property rights. This kind of research was done a good deal at the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago is the one school in the United States that really, really promotes the existence of markets and how markets work. And so some of the research here was done in the 1960s about how important this is. For anyone who's ever lived outside the United States, some of you would see that in these other places, that in other countries, we don't always see these clearly defined property rights or enforcement of contracts. And then many businesses then just decide not to do business there anymore. As an example of this, when Russia invaded Ukraine, many businesses removed themselves from Russia because they feared a government that just takes businesses or properties. And one of the notable examples of a country that left was McDonald's. And it's actually a really interesting article in The Economist magazine that you could look up if you're interested, or I could find it for you if you send me an email, that talked about that decision of McDonald's to remove itself from Russia was a really big decision for them. And part of it was their belief that property rights didn't really exist in Russia like they did in the past. And to be honest, this is also the reason, too, why some companies don't like to operate in China, is that they have some concerns about property rights as well. Okay, so I'm just going to skip this apply the concept, and so not because I'm against Karl Marx and Das Kapital. I'm not trying to promote capitalism here. I've got enough problems in this world. I just don't want to spend time on it. Okay.